Thank you very much. So, as I've been extensively introduced, I'm a professor in nutrition. I have a background as a public health medical doctor, and I do focus my research on nutritional policies in health, and more particularly on front of pack labeling in the last 10 years. So, we have been mentioning the Nutri-Score before, but in terms of how the label came about, it was initially developed based on the science on the effectiveness of different types of front-to-pack labels. And 3 criteria were retained for the effectiveness. First, that summary labels that only provide an overall indicator of the nutritional quality of the food is more efficient than an indicator that is based on nutrients. First, because for consumers to understand information on nutrients, they need to understand what it is. What is saturated fat? What is sugar? And if they have information on all of these elements, they need to prioritize. Should I be reducing salt rather than reducing lipids? What am I supposed to prioritize in terms of nutrients? And this is particularly important for vulnerable groups that do not have the ability or the education to actually completely understand and transform their food choices based on the information. So this led to this idea of having a summary label as being one of the key criteria. Second criteria is that a label that is potentially affixed on all foods, meaning on all the gradients of the foods, is more efficient than one that is only on the most healthy foods or the less healthy foods. Because if it's only in a fraction of foods, then it's easy to completely overlook it. If you have to look for it, if it's only 20% of foods that have the label, how do you take into account those that do not have the label? And more importantly, in terms of regulation, and it was presented before, for front-of-pack labeling can only be voluntary, meaning that if there is no label, does it mean that it cannot have a label because it's not healthy enough? Or does it not have a label just because the manufacturer decided not to ask for it? So it's more complicated to actually interpret the information of the absence of a label. And finally, the third criteria was that color-coded schemes are more efficient because they draw attention and they're easy to interpret rather than those that are monochrome. So this led to the development of the first 5-color nutrition label on the top that became the Nutri-Score in the end as a summary color-coded label with a gradient from A dark green to E dark red. So because it is a summary indicator of the nutritional quality of the food, it needs to rely on a nutrient profile model. So the nutrient profile models, there are a number of them that have been discussed in the scientific literature. But again, this is linked to the fact that the Nutri-Score is a front-to-pack label under the FIC regulation in the EU. So it needs to rely on information that is already at the back of the pack as much as possible, because it's a transparency tool. There are multiple nutrient profile models that would be potentially more accurate by adding vitamins, minerals, or ingredients. The problem is we don't have the information. So in order to calculate it, we would need to rely on industry information, and this would be a drawback for consumers in terms of transparency. So it relies, the initial nutrient profile model was developed in 2005 by an Oxford team in the UK and is now being used for regulation of the advertising to children in the UK. So it was at the moment the nutrient profile model for which there was the most validation in the scientific literature. It relies on 7 elements, 4 nutrients or elements that are considered rather unfavorable: energy, saturates, sugars, and sodium, to which it allocates between 0 and 10 points, so between 0 and 40 points theoretically. And then it balances it with the elements that are considered to be more favorable to health, being fibers, proteins, and the percentage of fruit, vegetable, legumes, nuts, and some vegetable oils that are considered to be favorable to health. So in the end, you have a final score that can range theoretically from -15 to +40. In terms of validation, to validate a front-to-pack label like the Nutri-Score, you need to validate 2 elements. First, the nutrient profile model, making sure that the way you have classified food is aligned with for example, with nutritional recommendations, that if you assess the diet of an individual based on the food choices that he makes with the nutrient profile, it's actually associated with nutritional status, and more importantly, it's associated with health, which would mean that the nutrient profile model could participate, if it's used to improve diets, it could participate to reducing the burden of nutrition-related diseases. So this is for the validation of the nutrient profile model. But then you need to make sure that the way you have translated it in terms of graphical format, the 5 colors, the fact that it is between green and red is completely and clearly understood. So there are 2 different types of studies that can be, a number of studies, but they can be globally put into 2 categories. Preference studies that ask participants, what do you like? Do you appreciate the label? Do you think it's important to you? How do you understand it? But this preference is also very much linked to familiarity with a number of things. So it's not necessarily the best way of investigating how a label would actually perform. So the most important ones are those that are based on not only preference, but performance. Do consumers actually understand the information as it is intended? Do they understand that B is maybe preferable than a D? It appears completely simple, but it's not that simple when you are faced with a choice with multiple foods in front of you. And finally, can they use it in purchasing situation? Do we really improve the nutritional quality of the shopping basket in the end? Does it really improve it? And then can it help to have a potential impact on health? So in terms of studies on the Nutri-Score, well, we have now more than 150 publications on the system that have investigated thoroughly all the elements that have been presented. So I'm just only going to focus on a number of them. So first, for the nutrient profile model, there have been multiple studies in cohort studies in France, in Spain, in Italy, and in a European cohort study that have shown consistently that the consumption of foods that are less well classified with the nutrient profile model is associated with increased risks of nutrition-related diseases, meaning cardiovascular diseases, cancers, weight gain and obesity, metabolic syndrome, and mortality of these diseases and mortality overall. So this consistency shows that the nutrient profile model is valid. The classification that we provide for foods has a meaning in terms of reducing nutrition-related diseases. So it's a step towards the good direction. In terms of regulation, the Nutri-Score came to being in a lengthy process. It took 3 years between the first time that it was mentioned and the actual decree after notification to the EU, with number of scientific processes. There were publications by independent research groups. There were expertise by Food Safety Agency, the High Council of Public Health. There was a consultation process with the various stakeholders, including industry, and finally Parliament and discussions in terms of the law and how the decree should be designed. During the consultation process, the Nutri-Score was not the only alternative that was put forward, in particular by the industry or by retailers. So there were comparative studies that were put forward under the umbrella of the Ministry of Health with alternatives labels that were proposed. So the Nutri-Score was one of the proposed systems that was developed by an independent research group. There was the SANS system that was developed initially by Carrefour and then promoted by the Retailers Association of France. There was Nutri-Repère that was put forward by industry that is a variant of what we know already as the reference intakes, providing the amount and percentage of different types of nutrients for a portion of the food. And finally, the multiple traffic lights that are currently in use as a voluntary system in the UK. There were 2 types of studies that were proposed, and the idea was to inform whether or not there would be a modification in the purchasing behavior of the consumer and where they would lead to improved nutritional quality of the choices of consumers. And 2 studies provided actually consistent results. The first one was a large-scale experimentation that took place in France in 60 supermarkets, 10 supermarkets per label and 24 control. It was in 4 regions of France during 10 weeks, and it was only on 4 types of shelves: the fresh deli, breads, pastries, and canned prepared meals. It was based on a voluntary introduction by industry, meaning that between 63% and 86% of foods were actually labeled during the study. And the study collected receipts, meaning actually what people bought completely. So 3 labels led to an improvement of the nutritional quality of the shopping carts. The first one was the Nutri-Score with plus 4.5% improvement, followed by the multiple traffic lights and the SIAL system. However, subgroup analysis showed that the Nutri-Score had the highest impact in subjects buying discount brands, so potentially more vulnerable groups. Again, these are key targets for policies in nutrition because those are the people that we leave behind when we do education systems, because they do not have the tools to translate the information that we provide into actual behavior. And more importantly, in some of the other labels, we had secondary detrimental effect with actually a deterioration of the nutritional quality of the shopping cart with the other labels in some subgroups, but not in the Nutri-Score. So this led to the Nutri-Score being actually the one that was the most efficient in that study. This was confirmed by an experimental economy study that was performed in Grenoble, in which it was an intervention in a control setting. Participants needed to make a first shopping cart without any label, and then they were randomized in one of the labels and had to decide whether or not they would choose to change or not the foods they would purchase. So the results showed that, again, the Nutri-Score was the one that was associated with the highest improvement in terms of nutritional quality of the shopping cart. And most importantly, when comparing the average, the overall sample, and those that had lower incomes, there was no loss of effectiveness, meaning that, in this case, the Nutri-Score acted as an equitable label. While, for example, when we look at the results for the multiple traffic lights, it is efficient overall, but there is a loss of effectiveness when you look at participants that had lower incomes, meaning that we would potentially leave these people behind if we implemented it, and it could lead to increased inequalities in nutrition and health. So after all these studies, the Nutri-Score was actually set into law, and as the official label for France, industry went from complete opposition with zero interest in the first time that the Nutri-Score was actually proposed to actually becoming a standard. Today, in 2022, more than 800 industry partners and manufacturers have agreed to go for the Nutri-Score and adopted it. And in 2020, the companies that have adopted the Nutri-Score do sorry, I am at a loss of words in English. They represent 50% of market share for the French market, and more than 57 during the last evaluation that was made in 2021. How does this relate to what foods actually have the Nutri-Score on? There was an investigation by the OQALI, Observatoire de la Qualité de l'Alimentation. Actually, there's a varying representation. Retailers having entered the scheme show that there is an equitable distribution of the Nutri-Scores. They have both A's and E's. But when you look at manufacturers, those that have entered the schemes are those that have in majority A and B. So we do not have as much representations of manufacturers that have E and D, while it would be actually important for the consumers to have this information. In terms of support, 95% of the population in France have either heard or seen the Nutri-Score, and it's constantly going up from the 42% in 2018. And more than 3/4 of the populations have already purchased a product that has the label on it and use them for the purchasing. So this is a huge improvement from where we were at the beginning of the Nutri-Score. It has an effect on sales. Some studies have shown that sales of products that are either A or B have increased, and that the sales of products that are either D or E have lowered, which is actually towards the goal that we aimed for, because it means that we have lowered the intake or consumption of foods that are high in salt, in sugar, or in saturated fats. Now the Nutri-Score is no longer just a French label. has developed outside of our national boundaries. It's been adopted in France, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and in Spain, and in Switzerland. I think I haven't forgotten anyone. So there is a transnational governance of the nutricals that has been put forward with a steering committee that coordinates how manufacturers can enter the scheme to ensure that it is harmonized across countries. And the scientific committee that has been tasked with the update of the algorithm underpinning the Nutri-Score to increase its alignment with food-based dietary guidelines in all of the countries that have entered the scheme and not only with French dietary recommendations. It is supported by scientists and learned societies with a petition that raised more than 417 signatures from scientists and 30 scientific groups that are supporting it. The issue now is the same that has been presented before. It's the question of how it's going to go with the ongoing discussion about the farm to fork strategy. The farm to fork strategy included within its framework the idea of having a harmonized and mandatory system for a front of pack label. There has been a report, an updated report by a joint research center that reviewed the evidence on the various types of front of pack labeling systems that actually are used in the EU. There was an consumption impact assessment in December 2020. There was an open consultation this year to inform how stakeholders related to the different types of labels that were on the options. And we're still waiting for the European Commission to have a proposal for a front of pack harmonized and mandatory system. We were expecting it by the end of this year. We know now that it's going to be postponed to the first trimester of 2023, hoping that it's not going to be postponed any further, considering discussions that are currently ongoing with the topic of front of pack labeling. And I'm just on time.
We can give round of applause. Thank you very much. Katja, she's not going anywhere. She's staying with us for 5 minutes more, 10 minutes for the discussions. I'm warning you. Is that okay? I know. Oh, yeah, but I'm keeping both of them. Okay, fantastic. Any questions? Because I've got so many comments. This is really interesting, right? Because you've got Nutri-Score cannot happen with the profiles. The profiles are not ready. So it's like, what is very important is that all the consumers are really interested to get more and more information. Can you ask her a question or not? And then I'm gonna have a next one which is gonna kill them.
Let's have a discussion.
Yes. What do you think do you think the Commission will stick to its announcement and we will get a Nutri-Score, nutrient profile plus front of pack mandatory labeling?
I have no idea. I hope so. The issue now is that the Nutri-Score relies on a nutrient profile model already. So the question is this nutrient profile model going to go towards what the Commission would like? I don't know. The question of developing a new nutrient profile model, I think if you start from scratch, you can still have in 10 years no nutrient profile model, because it's very difficult to, from scratch, having a profile model. I think from the perspective of front of pack labeling, it was always clear that we needed to rely on the available information based on the FIC regulation, meaning that there are a number of nutrients that we cannot use, even if we would want to.
What do you mean you cannot use?
For example, I would love to have added sugars rather than full sugars in the nutrient declaration. I would love to have free sugars or polyunsaturated fatty acids, but they are not in the declaration, so I cannot use them as a tool for transparency for the consumer. So I have constraints in what I can use for a front of pack label if I want it to be completely a tool for transparency. If I use nutrients that are not in the declaration, then no one can actually check if it's true or not. It needs to rely on industry information, and then you lose consumer trust, because if you need to have outside information to actually recalculate the label, then maybe something fishy is going on.
And this is really interesting because I think it was in one of your presentation, oh, I think it was yours, when you said, well, if there's no indication, it becomes fishy, or one may wonder, why are they not putting it? And then my question is, you mentioned different other alternatives to the Nutri-Score. Why do they not rely on the Nutri-Score? Why is it that they need to add more, like you mentioned, the one from Carrefour?
Well, the question is, typically what the alternatives that came up was because the industry was not actually happy with the idea of having any red in any foods, even if it's not, the red doesn't say you should not be eating it. It just says you should be eating it, but in lower quantities or maybe less frequently. It doesn't mean that it's completely toxic and you're going to die if you consume it. Else, it wouldn't be on the market if it were. So there's no surprise. I mean, in France, rillettes are E. It's not a huge surprise. It's full of fat. It's full of salt. We should not be expecting anything else. Nutella is, even if Ferrero doesn't want the Nutri-Score, is E. It's not a surprise. Doesn't mean you can't eat it. It just makes you aware of what you already know, which is it's kind of sugary and full of fat, and perhaps we should limit the amount of it that you use. So.
But the climate impact as
Put
well.
Nutella on vegetable.
Yeah, right.
So
how are you moving? Thank you. Sorry, Chantal. How are you pushing? So what's the point of following something which has been going on for years, which is just wasting Europeans' money on a discussion that keeps on going on and nothing is coming out of it?
There is one legal way is to lodge an action, a legal action against the European Commission because of his non-action, non-reaction before the European Court of Justice. It's difficult to move on, to move forward, but in this precise case, it could work because we have everything. I mean, we have all the grounds. We have the regulation, which has announced something, which never came. We have the perpetual confirmation by the European Commission that they are working on it, but actually they don't. Or they are really slow. So
I'm not going to defend the European Commission, but they've got so many subjects to tackle. The only thing is, once you've got one that is starting, you've got people associated and countries associated with it. So they are bound to work on it.
I think in this precise...
I think there has, well, in terms of steps forward, there was a report by the EFSA this year about the nutrients that an update of the 28. Yeah. Of the 28. It's an update of the nutrients that should be included in a nutrient profile model. However, from my perspective, as I said, from front to pack labeling perspective, for example, one of the nutrients that was highlighted was potassium. Yeah, great. We don't have potassium in the nutrient declaration. What can I do for a front to pack labeling? It's not going to help. So it's the idea of coming up with a new nutrient profile. I mean, nutrient profile models have been around. There are, I think, more than 40 different types of nutrient profile models that exist already that have been adapted. I mean, the Nutri-Score is already an adaptation of an existing nutrient profile. It's going to be updated. So we do have already some literature, some basis to form a decision based on nutrient profile models. So I would hope that the European Commission starts, rather than start from scratch and decide that they need to start over, maybe build on what is already existing, what has shown to be effective. But I don't know exactly if this is how they're going to end, meaning that it is a very controversial, at least politicized debate. It has gone outside of the arena of purely scientific questions and law questions. Now it's purely a political matter. I mean, in Italy, we've seen discussions that are completely outside of the scope of what the Nutri-Score is.
Save our Parmigiano.
Yes, it's with the idea that the Nutri-Score should be against the Mediterranean diet never being anything dealing with Parmigiano. And I mean, it's on the top of the pyramid. It's not on the basis.
Marisha, I remember in 28, when the nutrient profiles were really the hot topic, and we were convinced that the European Commission will define the European nutrient profile. A basic platform, it was the name of a new lobby, a new trade association, was built, was created, And among the members, you could find oil industry, cheese industry, and things like that. And they were all together, hand in hand, just in case the European Commission had the idea, the strange idea, to put them on the side and saying you're definitely too salty or too
That's
too
called
fat.
that's called lobbying.
That's called lobby.
That's
and
called
in this
lobbying.
precise case of the nutrient profile.
With the bad side of lobbying.
Yeah. For
So-
me, Nutri-Score and the front of pack nutritional labeling is a nutrient profiling, but it's not defining nutrient profile as setting a first criteria just to be authorized and allowed to bear a claim. This is really different, because by defining nutrient profiles as the first criteria, yes or no, you can bear a claim. It means that you are in or you are out. And saying, even if I remember it was a German food operator who was selling bread, and as far as I know, bread generally does not bear any real claim. It's not the purpose of this kind of pastries and breads. But just by announcing that they could be out, they say, "Wow, gosh, never!" and they will fight very strongly. So it's more. I mean, it goes far over any technical or scientific standpoint. It's political, as you said, and it's the European Commission is totally paralyzed because of the before pressure and the expected pressure they have to face.
I highly suggest, just in case you haven't seen it, it's on Netflix. It's called What the Health. Just watch it and no more comments afterwards. We're going to stop. The only thing is I'm just going to jump one thing. We've talked about the profiles. We've talked about the Nutri-Score, but we haven't talked, and we're not going to talk. This is just to put a little about the Echo Score. Oh, yes, go on. So don't hesitate to look at the Echo Score. 2 years. So we'll talk about this in 2 years in SIAL, which is to say Nutri-Score gives you something which is about your health. Echo Score says, let's say avocados are very good for you. They are, but they've got a footprint depending the health for the planet, depending where they're coming from. So don't hesitate to look also about the Echo Score, which is another subject. They'll come back in 2 years in the SIAL. We can give them a fantastic round of applause. Thank you very much.